You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today, returning to the podcast, is Fabio Rojas. Fabio, welcome back to Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So today we're going to be talking about some of Fabio's research on social media, and he has three big papers on the subject, one correlating Twitter activity with election outcomes, one talking about Twitter's glass ceiling. It's the effect of having your gender knowable from your Twitter profile picture on the spread of your tweets, and a third one on the Black Lives Matter movement and its spread through Twitter. So Fabio, tell me, how did you get interested in social media as a research topic and not just as a way of procrastinating?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, and it speaks to seizing opportunities. About 5 or 6 years ago, I got an email from a friend of mine, Michael Heaney, who co-authored a book with me on social movements. And he said, I met a student named Carissa McKelvey, and she's a student in the complexity program at Indiana University. And I said, I would love to meet her. So she sent me an email. Michael told her to come to my office and say hello. And in talking with Carissa, I had discovered that she got an undergraduate degree in political science. She's getting her PhD in complexity, which is kind of like a mixture of physics, social science, and math. And she was starting the graduate program, and she was kind of meeting different faculty. And I asked her to explain what her research interest was. And she said, well, here at Indiana University, we have a number of professors in computer science and engineering who are interested in social media. And one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to build something called the Social Media Observatory. You call it a user interface or a set of programmer tools that would help people go into the massive ocean of social media and do analysis. And at that time, my graduate student, Joe DeGrazia, was visiting my office as well. And I turned to Joe and I said, they have this great resource. Carissa's a student looking for research. And if you had the opportunity, what would you do? And he said, I would use social media to study elections. And that's how we got into it. And kind of the funny conclusion of that story, so we've been lucky to write a number of papers, but about a year or two later, I asked Carissa, why'd you come to my office and not the office of a political science professor? And she said, actually, I did. I went to 5 of them and they all said social media was silly to look at. And you're the only one who took me seriously. So it's kind of an interesting story of just keeping your eyes open and being open to new forms of data and being willing to work with new people.
Yeah, I mean, so much of our lives are in social media. So many interactions that 30 years ago we would have had in person or over the phone, in ways that a researcher couldn't observe, are now out there in public and recorded in some database somewhere. It makes a lot of sense to, mine that as a field of study and as a way to study social dynamics.
Yeah, that's really correct. And I think the initial resistance to studying social media was that a lot of social scientists, such as economists and sociologists and political scientists, they really want one of two things. They either want a high quality survey that is a representative sample of a population, or they want some sort of experimental design so they can tease out a causal effect. And that's kind of the standard in a lot of quantitative social science. And social media is usually not either one of those. It's not a random sample of people, nor is it a carefully controlled experimental environment. So initially, a lot of people just said, what's the point of studying this? It's neither a random sample or an experiment. What is the value in it? And I think the value in it is exactly what you just said, which is that it is an ongoing record of all our conversations. And I tell people, what if you had the power to go back to the French Revolution and listen in on a conversation? Or what if you could go to ancient Egypt and talk to people as they were building the pyramids? Wouldn't you learn a lot of very fascinating things that are not trivial? And I think social media is that kind of a resource where It is not a representative sample, but is highly informative. It's intrinsically interesting and has a lot of interesting properties that I think are very relevant to what most social scientists care about.
Yeah, and unlike a survey, or at least we think, social media can drive the outcomes. It's not just it's not just a sample of things that people are saying and thinking that we can just look at as sort of an indication of some other factor. In many ways, social media is the factor. Whether some hashtag gets shared 5 times or 5,000 times is the difference between a small conversation between a few people and a massive social movement.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And so there's a couple of things to remember. One is that we don't want to overblow the case. There are people who will say things like, Twitter or Facebook has a big causal effect on other things. We got to be careful. That's not always true. But in some cases, it is true. For example, I think of the Black Lives Matter movement. That was a conversation amongst a very small number of activists. And then when the hashtag Black Lives Matter took off, that movement was able to coalesce, it was able to crystallize and become a real thing. And so, one of the interesting questions that academics have about social media is whether social media data is pushing the real world or whether it's just reflecting the real world or whether it's like a lagging indicator of the real world. And I think we're at the beginning stages of trying to answer that question.
So let's go back to your first study, which was on elections. So, what election did you look at, and how did you tie Twitter activity into studying that election?
Yeah, great. So the first paper was published in PLOS ONE, that's the Public Library of Science. It's called More Tweets, More Votes, Quantitative Indicators of Elections. And so what we did is we started out with a very simple question, which is in what ways does social media indicate or act as a lagging indicator of political behavior? So what we said, so first of all, we read the literature and we discovered that actually there had been a series of papers written by other computer scientists that were essentially qualitative in nature. They would do things, they would look at, say, one election in Germany, they would look at a Bundestag election, and they start noticing things like the party that was most popular in the polls tended to be most talked about on Twitter. And they would find kind of interesting idiosyncratic cases, well, maybe not idiosyncratic, but individual cases where attention on social media preceded electoral success. So that was kind of the state of the literature in about 2012 or 2013. And so, in thinking about that literature, we asked ourselves, how could that be improved? What tools from social science could we use to really figure out that problem, to answer the question? And so, this is what we said. We said, number one, a lot of these studies are studies of one individual election in one individual country. So somehow we needed to get variation, right? And a basic idea of social science is that you always need variation in the independent variable in order to predict variation in the dependent variable. Because if you have no variation, there's really nothing to talk about. So first of all, we need some variation. And then number two, we needed to include control factors. So if you remember from your basic statistics 101 class, if X correlates with Y, that correlation may not be present once you control for other factors, and these are things you want to include in your model. So we said we need some variation. So we need a large number of cases, and also we need cases where we have extra data to get a sense of what other factors might be explaining the correlation. And so here's what we said. We said, what country in the world has a large number of predictable elections? The answer is the United States of America. It has 435 congressional districts. And what we could do is for each one of those districts, we could get the Republican and Democratic candidate. We could use various resources that scrape Twitter to get a count of how many tweets had mentioned the Republican or Democrat in each district, and then to create kind of a relative measure of social media presence, which is very simple, which is simply that the Republican share of the Twitter conversation is simply the number of tweets that mention the Republican candidate divided by the total, the sum of Republican and Democratic tweets that mention either candidate. So it's like a vote share percentage in political science. And then we said, take those 435 districts over two congressional cycles, 2010 and 2012. look at the tweets in the summer and fall preceding the election, then compute the relative vote share of each, and then compute the relative Twitter share of each, and see if there's a correlation. The answer is actually there's a pretty big correlation. And the article, you see this very beautiful scatter plot where you see that the higher percentage of tweets that mention the Republican in a district is a very nice correlate of the percentage of votes they end up getting in that district. And it turns out that you still get a statistically significant result, even when you control for things like incumbency, whether they voted for John McCain in 2008, unemployment, demographic composition, percent educated. We even had a measurement of how often candidates were measured on CNN and other websites. So even controlling for for traditional media presence, partisan tilt of the district, unemployment, demographic composition of the district, you still got a correlation between social media discussions of the candidate and their success at the polls.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised by that because I guess my perception is that a lot of the time when you're talking, a lot of people talk and vote not for what they like but against what they hate. And since you're just looking at the raw mentions, for instance, I know this wasn't the 2010 election, but Roy Moore became infamous for his personal life, and everyone was tweeting about what a terrible person he was. And I think if you ran that analysis on Roy Moore, he'd be a super big outlier in terms of getting mentioned a lot more, but always mentioned in a negative way. And so I guess what this evidence points to is that on average, when people are talking about candidates, they're generally talking about the candidate that they like or that they're going to vote for or that other people are going to vote for. But I guess you can't really tease out the sentiment or whether it's positive or negative commentary on any given candidate.
Well, actually, I'm going to push back a little bit on what you said. We have a different reading of the data, one that's actually very intuitive, which is basically it's not talking doesn't mean you're going to vote for that person or that you like that person. That's correct. However, talking is a measure of attention. And
Mm,
one of the things that we argue is that attention correlates with winning. So let me give you a great example. Which politician did Republicans talk about the most in 2010? Barack
int-
Obama,
yeah.
right? Doesn't mean they like him, but it meant that he won the election. And so the idea that we have is what we call the all publicity is good publicity model of social media.
Mhm.
That if people are talking about you, it probably means that you're about to win. And when they talk about you, they may talk about you because they like you or because they hate you. It doesn't matter why, but long as you're winning, you're going to attract more attention than the other guy. So, for example, how many people today like talking about Sarah Palin or John McCain or Mitt Romney? Some people do, but most people don't. They want to talk about the person who won the election. Then another issue that you brought up, which actually I do agree with, you used the example of Roy Moore. One thing that we've discovered in this data and by kind of following other elections is that scandals are a way of distorting the data. So
Mhm.
that's a case where a candidate could be losing, and it's very clear they're going to lose. There's clearly no support for the person. But because of a personal scandal or some other issue, they start getting a lot of attention. And that actually creates a lot of false positives in the data. However, the upside of it is that if you look at a large sample of elections, and this is why it was important to look at a large sample and not one individual country, that one or two cases of a scandal are not going to really throw the results very much. So, if you have a Roy Moore scandal, that's okay, but there's 100 seats in the Senate, not just one.
Mhm.
And remember that, we're talking about social media is not a direct measurement of political opinion or political strength. It's an indirect measure, right? So it's going to be susceptible to other factors that distort it. So, yeah, so when you think about social media, you always have to remember that we're not making a claim about one election, we're making a claim about a population. And in that population, there's going to be a couple of false negatives or false positives. But we actually do talk about in the paper a little bit about when social media is not a good measure of political strength.
Yeah. Are these elections do they generally only have two candidates? Like at this point, so unlike a primary, at this point, the each party has their one candidate, and then other people are running for third parties. They're just noise. They're getting 1 or 2%.
Yeah, so one of the lessons of the political science literature is that you should really ignore third parties in American politics.
Hmm.
They tend to be very small. They tend to be very unpredictable. One year they may get 0.5% of a vote total. Another year they may get 5 or 6%. So we took that to heart, and in building our model, we only looked at general elections. We did not look at primaries. So we only looked at places that had a Republican and a Democrat candidate. Also, we did not look at elections where one of those candidates had dropped out or if the candidate was running unopposed. So you would start with 435 elections, districts, and then you get down to about 405 or 407, depending on the year. And so we're looking at one on one matchups. And one thing that is definitely true about studying politics and elections is that when you go from a two-party system to a three-party system, things get complicated pretty quickly. So that
Hmm.
was another reason that we focused on the U.S. Congress, where you have 435 districts. They're all roughly the same size. They usually have a Republican and Democratic candidate on both sides. They're easy to track. They're easy to follow. And there's a clear winner at the end of each one. It's pretty rare that there's a runoff. And so, yeah, but we do not do primaries. And I think that's an open question for this area of research. You could ask yourself, how does the world of social media reflect an election at the primary stage rather than the general election stage? And here it's a very interesting issue because number one, most voters don't vote in primaries. Most people don't vote in elections at all, but they vote even less in primaries, which means a very small number of people is influencing an election. People jump in and out of the election at very late dates. There's a lot of volatility. So it's really interesting to ask, who is it that would talk about a primary election candidate that early, right? In a part of the election that most people don't care about. And so I would hope that some future researcher really starts nailing down that question. It's a really good topic.
Yeah, it occurs to me in a first past the post election with more than two candidates, the voters really need to coordinate on who the front runners are, which is kind of, a self-fulfilling prophecy of if people think you're a front runner, then they're going to eliminate other options from consideration because even if they like them more because they want their vote to count, right? And so they want to not split the vote and vote for someone who's only going to get 2 or 3% of the vote. And so having having a lot of attention is a way to establish yourself as one of the options. For instance, there were a lot of primary candidates that ran against Donald Trump, but the one candidate that everyone talked about, and I thought this was going to be your example before you said it was 2010, but in 2016, Donald Trump was the one everyone was talking about all the time, and people were really shocked that he was able to win his primary and then eventually the election, but certainly fits well with the all publicity is good publicity model.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump is a fascinating example. As much as I disagree with him personally, he's still fascinating to talk about.
Hmm.
So, in the computer science world, amongst the people who study kind of social media and elections and kind of tracking political opinion online, one thing that people noticed, even as it was happening, was that Donald Trump's media presence and presence on social media was unlike any other candidate. It's just that he has a gift for projecting himself into the media. And more traditional political campaign professionals kind of appreciated his strategy because what is true about primary battles is that most of the people who compete in the primaries don't have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of name recognition. And the way that you kind of pull away from the rest of the pack is exactly what you said, Garrett, which is just you need a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Once somebody anoints you as as the front runner or the favorite candidate, you pull away. And this is one reason why political scientists have usually found Trump once again being an exception, but in other cases it's true. Most people have discovered that people who are anointed or endorsed by party leaders tend to do very fine in elections because they get that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy going.
Mm.
And Trump completely bypassed that process. He possesses an access to the media that most candidates would never have. And that allowed him to essentially hog up media attention which then led to a decline in campaign donations and volunteer hours and all the stuff you need to running the campaign. So what Trump was doing was essentially using the media to kill off all competition in the primary and then emerge the winner, even though he might not have been the most popular candidate. And in the primary, even though I think he got in a majority of the delegates in the Republican convention, my memory of the estimate is that he didn't top 50% of the popular vote. That was split amongst many other candidates.
Mm.
And so Trump is an excellent example of what you're talking about, where Trump would use the traditional media and especially Twitter to essentially eclipse the other characters, destroy their public presence, destroy their media presence, which then led to a financial collapse and the withdrawal of many candidates.
Yeah,
It's an
yeah.
epic story, truly.
It is, and if one of the other candidates had been able to establish themselves as the single non-Trump option, or the main competing option to Trump, then the whole primary may have gone very differently. But it seemed like everyone was jostling for that role, and no one, the people who didn't like Trump had no one to coordinate on. So failure of coordination there.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the interesting kind of campaign facts is that Senator Ted Cruz was often seen as the alternative, but he has so much personal animosity with other people in the Republican Party that he kind of forfeited that opportunity to be the alternative to Trump. And I don't know if you remember, but he actually won the Iowa caucus. He won a number of other states, but people were not able to get around him because of his history of kind of squabbling with other people in the GOP, and that kind of allowed Trump to emerge and to just squish everybody else.
Yeah, it's I'm sure that story will go down through history of how this
Yeah, be nice
very
to your friends.
very strange sort of political place the world is in now, how that happened, and all the little things that added up to a very narrow electoral victory for a very strange candidate. Moving to some of your other research, so you did a study on Black Lives Matter, and the spread of the hashtag, and the spread of the movement through Twitter. And you mentioned earlier that it started out as a small conversation between a few activists. So give me some background on what Black Lives Matter and how it started small and got big.
Right. So Black Lives Matter is a political movement. I may call it progressive movement, a movement for social and racial justice. And their main goal is to reduce social inequality in society, mainly racial inequality, but also economic inequality and gender inequality. They got famous because their first initial issue was kind of confronting police departments over the way blacks are treated, when they're pulled over, and then, when the police come into contact with them. And so they become a very important movement in American politics. And so, what the research I did about Black Lives Matter was to trace the presence on Twitter over a very critical 2 year period. And you may remember that there was a young man named Trayvon Martin
Hmm.
who was killed in Florida. And what happened when we discovered in the data was that people actually were talking about not Trayvon Martin. They were talking about Black Lives Matter before Trayvon Martin was killed. So there was a presence of Black Lives Matter. And in our data, the presence is very small. Like if you look at the number of tweets and the number of people who say the phrase Black Lives Matter in their discussions, the number is in the hundreds. So imagine, all of Twitter, hundreds of millions of people on it. Only a couple hundred people use the phrase Black Lives Matter. Then the Trayvon Martin case happens. He is killed. Mark Zimmerman is arrested. And then there's the shooting with Michael Brown in Ferguson. And when Darren Wilson is acquitted over the Michael Brown shooting and Zimmerman's acquitted over the Trayvon Martin shooting, then what happens is you see a very abrupt and sudden escalation of Black Lives Matter on Twitter. And it's very clear when you look at the data. If you just ask every day how many people say the phrase Black Lives Matter or how many people use the hashtag, it's a couple hundred, maybe 1,000. Then it jumps up to 5, 15, 50,000 over the course of a couple days.
Mm.
So Ferguson and the Trayvon Martin killing were the issues that really brought Black Lives Matter to national attention. And people used Twitter and they used social media to spread their message in a very quick way. and to spread the movement in a much broader fashion than had been possible before. So a lot of the research is really kind of documenting that kind of lightning in a bottle effect where they just hit at the right time and they're able to get their message out. And then a second thing that we do in the paper, and by the way, I should mention my authors, Jelani Ince, so the Department of Sociology, and Clayton Davis of the School of Informatics, who helped out with this paper. What we also did is we looked at the other hashtags that were mentioned with Black Lives Matter. So it's kind of a social network analysis where you say, when people look at Black Lives Matter, what else do they start talking about? And it's a very interesting pattern that when Black Lives Matter starts, they start mentioning other police shootings a lot. Then, as time evolves, then they start introducing specific social protest tactics. Like they start talking about boycotts and whatnot. But near the end, what you see is a very interesting emergence of kind of white nationalists and kind of what we call counter protesters. People who are protesting the protesters. We call those counter protesters.
Mm,
So that's when people start saying, oh, white lives matters, all lives matter. And when you start looking at the kind of people and the kind of responses to Black Lives Matter in that data, that's a very interesting development. So what the paper tries to do is to try to trace the Black Lives Matter hashtag in real time, connected to real world events, but then also to see what else is developing around the movement. So early on, it's just about figuring out what the movement is about. Then they move on to tactics. Then the counter movement activists, they show up and they start talking back to the movement. And we think this is very fascinating because it really shows you what is unique about social media, which is that it is a world where millions of people can speak directly to a social movement. So this is no longer the case where Martin Luther King would get up there and give the I Have a Dream speech and people would listen, right? They may clap and cheer, but it's a one way discussion. This is a world where an activist can get up, start a conversation, then everybody adds their 2 cents in, and everybody starts adding different concepts, different ideas, or even criticisms of the movement in real time. And that is
mm.
really the fascinating thing about studying social media, which is you can see all this develop in real time.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it I kind of find with Twitter that although you can put your 2 cents in, you usually it is that's where it ends when you as the the famous person with the blue check mark tweets something and they get 1,000 retweets, and then you who is a non-famous person says yes and or no but and that's typically where it ends. I have a lot of frustration with Twitter just for the long. I think I was on it for years and I got no response ever but until I had gradually built up enough followers to get maybe one or two responses. uh, so unlike Facebook, Twitter doesn't scale down quite as well. But the nice thing about Twitter for research purposes is just how public it all is, right? So you do sometimes have those small conversations between one or two people, which a retweet by a prominent person can suddenly make into national conversations or international conversations.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating aspect of social media, which I think people don't appreciate, which is, think about 100 years ago, right? And maybe you and I would be having this conversation in person, say a bar or or a cafe or something, right?
Mhm.
And even if somebody overheard it and said, "Hey, that's a really cool thing they're discussing," what's the chance that that would be rebroadcast to millions of people? The answer is about zero, right? But
Mhm.
you're right. But social media is a way for lots of people to listen into lots of conversations, and in a few cases, really escalate them and rebroadcast them out to very large numbers. Just the other day, on my own Twitter account, at Fabio Rojas on Twitter, somebody found an old blog post I wrote 10 years ago, and a very well-known writer and kind of computer journalist and computer program, Dara Lind, she discovered this blog post and she retweeted it.
Huh.
And I didn't even know about it. But the same day I started getting messages like, oh, that's so cool that Dara Lind, this kind of superstar writer, she retweeted something that you wrote. And I didn't even know. But I think that just speaks to how interesting social media is and that there's a huge range of visibility on the medium, right? So some people may have a handful of followers. Actually, we know from research most people don't have any followers, or they only have a couple. And then a few people, so it's like a power law distribution, a few people have a huge following.
Mm.
And if one of those people picks you up, then these small things can build up. You can get more of a following, or these ideas can get kind of amplified to a degree that's never been seen before in history.
Oh man, just thinking about 10 years ago, I had just graduated high school. I don't think I'd want something I wrote then to suddenly rise to huge prominence. But I'm glad you were pleased by this. This was presumably something you were not embarrassed to have written, because you weren't a teenager 10 years ago.
I
But
was already teaching
yeah,
already,
yeah,
so it's
yeah.
it's not that big of a deal. But I think anybody below the age of 25 should have a get out of free card when it comes to social media. People do some very unwise things.
Yeah, yeah. It's odd, right? Because you don't know, and there's no one who decides, except these people with, massive followings, what's going to be big and what's not. You can just be having a conversation that you think only 100 people are going to hear, and you see people who just make a, like, who had 20 followers, and then they make a joke and it's pretty funny, and someone prominent sees it and suddenly they have, 3,000 retweets on their little joke, and they're now, and a bunch of those people hit follow, and now this person who isn't famous for any particular reason, and it's not didn't sort of rise through the traditional channels of, being really big in the media or politics or business or something. Suddenly they're one of the influencers. uh, just sort of, there's it's almost, it feels very random.
Yeah, when I teach about media in all its various forms, including social media, I really emphasize the point that you just made, which is that there's something radically democratic about social media. Maybe it's not egalitarian. It doesn't mean everybody gets an equal voice. I don't think that's true. But I tell people, like, if you wanted to print a book 500 years ago, that was a hideously expensive process. You had to, like, set the letters, you had to, set the type, you had to literally press it with your hands and then cut it and then bind the books. I mean, and of course it's better than writing them by hand. It's obviously an improvement over medieval times, but still, you're lucky if you could print, say, 1,000 books or 2,000 books. But social media is the first time in history where media is really bidirectional. It's not just somebody in a broadcasting booth talking to millions of people. People put stuff out there, they have interactions, and it's an opportunity for people who don't have business connections or connections to Hollywood or the entertainment industry to actually create an audience for themselves. So I think your podcast is an excellent example of that.
Hmm.
1950, maybe a couple of radio stations would have a public interest TV show that would talk about economics or social science or what have you. But now with podcasting, anybody could do it, or blogging, or tweeting, or whatnot. And the interesting thing is that different social media platforms have different capabilities that we're only beginning to understand. Like, what can you do on Twitter that you can't do on Facebook? What can you do on Facebook that you can't do on Instagram or Snapchat or some of these other formats? And, it feels like we've had social media forever, but the opposite is true. We've only had it for 10 years, right?
Yeah.
And so we're going to discover over time, what can be done with this format. And we've already learned that you can make a very economically valuable company, right? There's a lot of economic value in these media. We've discovered it's a bit more open than traditional forms of social media. We also discovered it can be dangerous, right? Like if somebody is doxxed or humiliated on social media, that can be very bad for them. They could lose a job. We also learned a lot of lessons about privacy, that social media tends to cycle old stuff that may embarrass you 5 or 10 years from now.
Hmm.
So this is an important thing about, and I think this is why social scientists should spend time understanding social media, because it's a new form of communication that we've never seen before, and we just don't know what's going to happen with it. It's just a genuinely new territory, but at the same time, it can be exciting. There's a lot of good stuff to learn about it, such as who becomes famous on it. That's a really great question to ask.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, there's so many interesting aspects of this, like just the huge extent that what's famous and who's famous and what, social movement gets big and which one doesn't, how much it comes down to just the algorithms that decide what to show us. So, YouTube, I mean, I could probably do a whole episode about YouTube if I could find someone who's an expert on YouTube algorithms, but when they change their algorithm from number of viewers to number of minutes watched, it radically changed what kind of videos people were making and seeing on YouTube. And, this was just, some back end decision that they made, and, some coder just changed a variable and here the direction of culture, insofar as culture is affected by YouTube, was radically shifted.
Yeah, that's right. And I think YouTube is a great example because, think about old media, like say making a regular celluloid film, right? You go to a theater, you see it. How would they make those? Well, first of all, you got to get a lot of money up front to pay for all these actors, to pay for the studio. Then you have to make a bunch of movies, and most of them will not even finish production. So that's one of the secrets of Hollywood, which is lots of films get started, but a lot of them never really finish up. Then you make a few of them, and then maybe 1 out of 20 will be a hit and make its money back, right? So the moment from when you start collecting the funds to invest in a motion film production to when you have data about what people actually pay for and like can be years, even decades, right? In contrast, think about YouTube. If one Google programmer decides to change the search algorithm for Google, or to change, the algorithm that tells you what you might like to see, that will give you instant effects. You will learn what people do in response to that very, very quickly. So it's a much more interactive approach to culture than we've seen before. So it's not just interesting in the variation you see, it's also going to be interesting in the terms of the speed of the change of culture, how fast culture changes, because you could just switch one algorithm, you could change this or that, and the next day you'll have data on what people are watching differently.
Hmm.
And that's just going to speed up the cycle of innovation and make it go way, way faster. So, kind of one of my predictions is that the quality of YouTube videos, however you might measure that, will grow a lot faster than, say, the quality of cinema 100 years ago or the quality of print newspapers from 150 years ago. The cycle, the feedback and information cycle is going to be very, very quick, very, very fast.
Yeah, yeah, but I'd add a caveat to that, which is that this change that YouTube made that I mentioned from number of views to number of minutes watched, it really incentivized people making a lot of content, high volume of content that people, would maybe turn on in the background and sort of just leave running for a long time. So let's plays where people play a video game and just record the screen and maybe do some commentary. That's something that you can sit down and make an hour of content in 1 hour, just with like maybe half an hour setting up and uploading and writing a description or something. And that was highly incentivized by this change. Whereas before, there was more the spending a month making one super high quality 5-minute video with a lot of editing and production value. Not like production value in terms of spending a lot of money, but just spending a lot of time on one thing. So in terms of what kind of quality we get, whether it's having one really great video or several hours of sort of okay content, mildly engaging content, it depends a lot on what algorithms are determining the goal.
So you're saying that my 5-year-old is driving YouTube right now. Is
Oh
that what
yeah,
you're
for
saying?
sure. if
Yeah,
if
because
she's
he
on it,
loves those games. Yeah, he loves those game
yeah.
videos where people just play games and he watches other people get high scores in all kinds of video games. That's like his thing.
Yep. That is driving a lot of YouTube. So let's move to your third paper here. Twitter's glass ceiling. This one's
Sure.
interesting because it looks at just something that I think there have been a lot. There's a lot of interest in this, but just having I'm on Twitter and I'm on various social media networks, and I use my real name, which is a very gendered name, and I use my real picture, which I think is clearly male. And then some people, they have pseudonyms, or they don't have a picture of them in their, as their profile picture, and you can't tell what gender they are. And then some people have, some people are female, and you can tell what gender they are by their picture, etc. And we, I think, sociologists in particular, and psychologists, and have always sort of theorized that people react differently to when the person they're talking to is a different gender, and there have been experiments on it. But this is sort of the first chance to do a really, really big real world experiment on just how your gender affects, or your perceived gender affects the way people react to you. So tell me, how did you approach this topic in this paper?
Right. So the background to all of this is that sociologists have long taken an interest in how gender and other social characteristics affect how people treat you. Right. And there's a lot of evidence indicating that people make a lot of snap decisions about you. So if they see that you're black or white, they'll make a decision one way. They see you're male or female, they'll make a decision in another way. And these things can be important because they lead to all kinds of consequences, such as, say, dating, marriage, employment, opportunities for economic advancement. So there's a whole literature, empirical and theoretical, talking about why people would use these social characteristics as cues for interaction. So kind of inspired by this earlier literature, we decided to ask some very simple questions about Twitter, and ask the question, to what degree does your perceived or presented gender affect the number of followers you have and the number of retweets and whatnot? And so, in the literature on gender in sociology and other fields, there's this idea of the glass ceiling. And what the glass ceiling says is, okay, well, maybe in the past there was a strict division of labor between men and women, that women were just not supposed to be in certain occupations. Maybe they're banned by custom or they're banned by law. But the point is there was a strict separation, but that's now come to an end. And in modern culture, we have a situation where women can enter just about any profession, not every single one, but just pretty much most professions you can imagine. But still, due to a number of factors, women are not reaching positions of leadership within those professions. So some people have argued that this is due to not racial, but gender-based discrimination, that people don't want female leaders. They're less willing to hire women into positions of leadership in firms. There are other people who believe that life course issues, such as having children, makes it more difficult for women to reach positions of leadership. But regardless of what the mechanism is, there's a clear empirical prediction of that theory, which is that men and women may be equal in a lot of respects, except at the most elite levels of a job or the most elite levels of a firm. So we asked the question, well, does this hold true for social media? Is it the case that social media has a glass ceiling? So once again, we go to Twitter, and we asked the question, if you take a large sample of people, we took a sample of 100,000 people, user accounts, and we did that to ensure, the statistical power of the study so that even the smallest effects would be picked up or the rarest events would be picked up. And we asked the question, does perceived gender affect the number of followers you have? So to answer that question, you have to do two things. You have to get some sort of measure of visibility. And here we start with followers, which is the standard measure of visibility among social media researchers, which you mentioned earlier about your own Twitter experience. You want to get more followers. So we took that as our dependent variable. But then the question is, how can you tell what somebody's gender is? And this is kind of one of the interesting parts of the paper. So we said, well, there's not one way that people will judge your gender, but we could look at a couple. We did two. First, we look at your name. And if it says Susan Johnson, we classified that as female. So how do we know whether your name is male or female? Because we're not going to read all 100,000 names. So what we do is we look at the U.S. Census database, and we say, if the U.S. Census records 95% of the people with the name Susan as female, we'll say that's a female name. If 95% of the Michaels in the world are male, we'll call that a male name, and otherwise it'll be ambiguous. So that's one way we recorded or estimated or guesstimated what your perceived gender might be. The other thing we did is we took people's profiles, their pictures that they put up on social media and their profile image, and we fed it into a program called Face++.
Hmm.
which tries to estimate various social characteristics such as age, gender, and race. And we decided to keep it simple to say, if we fed this picture into a facial recognition program, would it guess male or would it guess female? So using these two measurements of how you present yourself on social media, we can then ask, is there actually a glass ceiling for women on Twitter? And lo and behold, the answer is yes. And for about three-quarters of the distribution, if you look at the distribution of visibility as measured by number of followers, for the first half, it's almost identical. Basically, lots of people just don't have that many followers and they're statistically indistinguishable from each other. But once you get to about three-quarters, about 75th percentile or so, you start seeing a gap. And then the bigger it goes, the bigger the gap gets. So what that's telling us or suggests to me at least, is that amongst the most elite Twitter users, there may be a preference for male Twitter users over female ones. Another interesting thing we found from the research is that there's a large number of people or a large number of accounts that do not display any gender at all. These could be corporate accounts or accounts that are never used that only have kind of a default image or no text in the name. Or people have very unusual names. So, for example, somebody in our database is called like the dance floor. They'll have kind of a funny name. But once you get rid of all the corporate accounts and all the ambiguous ones and stick to things that are clearly male or female, you do see the pattern and it's very stark. So what that suggests to us is that a lot of the same processes that determine the relationship between gender and work or gender and rewards in the offline world are actually present in social media as well. It's a very interesting finding.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and you present a table in your paper showing the correlation between your name variable and your image variable, and it's very high. So in general, someone named John is going to have a male looking profile picture, and that correlation is pretty good. So it kind of speaks to these measures as being pretty good measures since they correlate so well with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that's kind of interesting about social media is that some people have an image. You might call it the 4chan version of the world.
Mm.
If you're not familiar with 4chan, 4chan is a website where everybody's anonymous and people just say the worst things about each other like all the time,
Oh
right?
yeah.
They put up all kinds of really sensationalistic or very aggravating or acrimonious kinds of content anonymously. That's not how most of social media looks. In most of social media, people actually want to present an identity because they care about things. So if you're Garrett and you care about economics, you're going to put your face up there, you're going to put your name up there, you're going to put some identifying information up there. And one thing you discover with social media is that there's a wide range of different platforms that encourage different kinds of behavior. And over time, a lot of those platforms have encouraged people to be a little bit more public with their identity, to provide a little bit of information to make it more reliable and a little bit more accountable. Probably one extreme is LinkedIn, the business website where you have to provide a real name. They will not let you use any pseudonym at all. And they want you to put information that links you to specific jobs. So if you go on LinkedIn and you harass people, it's very easy to get rid of you because you have a real identity that can be cracked down on. Then maybe at the other extreme is something like 4chan, where literally there's no identity at all. There's no way of linking one post to another post. You don't even know who's putting stuff up there. And you realize that a lot of the social media that most people, maybe not hackers or computer science types, but most social media that most people like are things like LinkedIn, Facebook, things that have some element of identity, so that people actually have something to work with and they can build a reputation over time and build followers and have stories with other people. And that's one interesting thing we found that people actually do put up their gender, maybe not all the time, but a lot of the time. And that's an important thing.
Yeah, yeah. There's such a divide between spaces on the internet where people are nice to each other, people are kind, and often debate in good faith and behave fairly well, and the spaces where people are just absolutely brutal and awful to each other. And and I believe there's research on this, but I think anonymity is one of the big variables, and just curation. If they're aggressive moderators on some websites trying to make kick out all the trolls so that the discussion space is generally good for everyone, then that makes a difference. But really, just showing who you are and your face and your name. Not only does it make you accountable, and it makes you less likely to, just fling out slurs or insult people, but I think other people too are going to react to you and be less likely to say something really nasty to a person whose face they've seen. Right? It's by putting a face to the person you're arguing with or talking to on Twitter, it makes you maybe identify with them a little more strongly. Maybe makes you a little more empathetic.
Well, one of the interesting things that we've learned from social media, from exactly what you're saying, is that there's more than one way to a civilized community, right? So if you read like a classic philosopher like Thomas Hobbes, he'll say something like, well, why is the world not violent and nasty all the time? Well, the answer is you have a strong authority that comes in and keeps order for you, right? But one thing
Sometimes.
we've learned from social media is that that's not the only way that things happen, right? That people, when there's some accountability, some face to face interaction, there is actually some element of humanity that wants to be very sociable, right? So if I know that you're a real human being, I've met you, I've spoken with you, I know that you have children, or I know what your favorite hobby is, then it makes you a little bit more human and makes you behave a little bit better. And a lot of the social media platforms that have absorbed this lesson are improving over time. Probably the one you can think of is Reddit. Reddit used to be regarded as a real kind of nasty place for really vicious commentary. But then the owners of Reddit said, no, we want to put an end to that. A little bit of that's happening on YouTube. Twitter is trying to clean up as well. And I think that's what people are realizing, that the social and economic value of a platform where everybody's just mean to each other is actually not as high as it would be in a place like LinkedIn, where there's a huge amount of trust and reliability.
Hmm.
And I think that's a very deep lesson that we can get from the study of social media today, which is that if you give a little bit of identity, reserve anonymity for fewer cases rather than more cases, then you create an incentive for a better environment, which can have social, personal, and economic benefits.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean with Facebook, just when everyone's mom got on Facebook and added them, I think it calmed things right down because you don't want to be yelling at someone and have your mother or your family see what a jerk you're being.
Yeah, no, that's a really great example, which is maybe the short. You know how in a political economy they say that you're in a good country if it has a McDonald's, because
Hmm.
that's a sign that the country is well developed. Maybe the analog for social media is that when it's safe for your mom to show up, it's probably a healthy form of social media.
Yeah. So I've sort of got off the main thread of your paper, which is the difference between men and women on Twitter. So having
Right.
identified them, and you've noticed this discrepancy between the number of followers and the number of retweets. Do you have any hints about the direction of causation? Do men and women behave differently on Twitter, or is it more about the people reacting to them?
Well, I think that's a really great question. We don't have a complete answer to, but we have a partial answer. So in the paper, when we try to do a regression model of the number of followers you have, we tried to, answer the criticism to say, well, maybe the gap between men and women is due to the fact that men have been on Twitter longer than women. So we do that. We say, looking at the account's creation date, when it was created, does that remove the effect? No, it doesn't. Does the number of tweets that a person writes? So you can say, well, maybe men and women are different in terms of the amount of content that they create. If you include that variable, the results do not change. Another thing that you might say is that maybe men and women are talking about different things. So, for example, one thing that Twitter researchers have discovered is that Twitter is big for sports. People love talking about sports on Twitter. So you might have a hypothesis to say, well, maybe if men are more likely to speak about sports, that explains their higher popularity. Once again, if you include the lists that people are included in, so if I include economics as a control variable for the type of list that you might be included on, that does not change the effects. So this suggests to us we have some more work that experimentally looks into this, but it's in progress. But that suggests to us that some of the differences are actually in the perception of the person. And we know that from earlier research that that often women are perceived in a negative way if they're seen in a position of authority.
Mm,
And so that is something to look into to see if that's actually true. But it's probably the difference that we observe in the paper is probably not due to the intensity of use or the kinds of things that men and women talk about. It really seems to be relying on the emerging from the person who's using Twitter, the user, not the person that we're examining.
right. So it's the person who sees the tweet and decides whether to hit retweet or not, or
Yeah,
reply, or hit follow on this person, and not so much
right,
the the person themselves. It'd be
right.
really interesting if for a follow up study if you could get some kind of data set where you could find out for those people who are ambiguous, who don't have a picture of their face and don't have a gendered name, if you had some kind of independent measure of their gender, and then you could compare actual gender to perceived gender, or maybe just looking at, say, women with traditionally masculine names and men with traditionally feminine names, and maybe and see if to compare perception to reality. But that's something where you'd need to find some other source of data beyond just Twitter itself, because you're looking at the same things that the users are looking at ultimately.
Right, correct. And that's part of one of the reasons we're doing some experiments where we're having M-Turkers read Twitter websites, the person's profile. And we ask them questions like, does this person look reliable? Would you trust this person? Would you follow them? That's still their opinion. It's not observing them in the wild as they read Twitter, but it definitely provides some additional insight. And hopefully that paper will be published sometime soon.
Ah, that's interesting. So we're just about out of time. Do you have any closing thoughts on any of the topics we've talked about, social media and the study of it generally?
Yeah, I just think it's one of the most exciting aspects of social science right now. We live in a period where we can have a really unimaginable depth of data. We have this amazing depth of data, what people are saying, what they're talking about. It's not a silver bullet. I don't want to imply that, social media is the beginning and end of every conversation, but certainly enormously important. And it's definitely worth studying. And I hope that the discussion of these three papers will show your listeners that there's a lot of interesting stuff to be studied in that realm.
My guest today has been Fabio Rojas. Fabio, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
If you enjoyed that episode of Economics Detective Radio, you can find more at economicsdetective.com. The discussion question for this week is, if you were going to perform a study on social media, let's say you had access to a whole lot of social media data, what kind of study would you like to do? Just assume that you can have any data set you want and that you could have the funding and the time needed to do this kind of thing. What would you like to know about social media that you don't really know right now? Propose a hypothesis, maybe. So to contribute to that discussion, to answer that question, head over to Economics Detective on Facebook. It's a closed group, and you can ask to be included in it, and there are a couple questions, and then I'll let you in the group, and you can discuss. I'll be back next week, hopefully. I know I've missed a couple weeks, but as this summer has been quite busy, and a lot of people that I've contacted have been busy as well, so just having a little trouble keeping up to a weekly schedule, but I'll try to get back on it and try to get a backlog of episodes recorded so I can miss a week without missing a podcast release. So thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting the show.